This is Marcus Reed, broadcasting live from what remains of Coastal Radio 103.5, coming to you from the third floor of the Bayside Media Building. It's 7:15 a.m., November 14th, 2032. Good morning to those of you still with power. Good morning to those listening on hand-crank radios. Good morning to the boats and the high-rises and the makeshift communities on rooftops. The National Weather Service has issued another storm surge warning for the eastern seaboard. That makes 5 this month. I can see it from my window now, the water that wasn't there when I started at this station 15 years ago. Main Street is now a canal. The old movie theater marquee sticks out from the water like a forgotten signpost. Now showing Aquaman 4, it reads, ironically preserved from the last film they screened before the permanent flooding began. Sometimes at low tide, you can still make out the ticket booth, a strange monument to our former lives. Some of you remember when I used to do the traffic reports. I'd hover above the city in the station's helicopter, tracking slowdowns and accidents, telling you which routes to avoid. Now I report on water levels, storm warnings, and evacuation zones. The irony isn't lost on me. The roads I once monitored for congestion are now navigational channels. The morning commute happens in boats and on makeshift bridges between buildings. For those just tuning in, the latest NOAA report confirms what many have suspected. The Antarctic ice sheet collapse has accelerated. We're looking at another 8 inches of sea level rise by next year. The thermal expansion of warming ocean water accounts for about 30% of that. The rest is pure meltwater from ice that stood frozen for millions of years, now returning to the oceans. I remember interviewing Dr. Sanchez from the Oceanographic Institute 5 years ago. She warned us this was coming sooner than the models predicted. Everyone thought she was being alarmist. The mayor called her catastrophist on this very station. 2 years later, his office was under 3 feet of water during the spring king tide. I visited him as he salvaged family photos from his desk drawers. He didn't want to be recorded that day. Last week, I toured what remains of the East Harbor neighborhood with the Coast Guard. We navigated between submerged cars and street signs in their shallow draft boat. The officer pointed out dark shapes beneath the water, remnants of gardens, playground equipment, the ordinary artifacts of everyday life now claimed by the sea. A child's bicycle, a mailbox, a patio umbrella still planted in its stand, waving gently in the underwater currents. We passed a partially submerged 3-story apartment building. Salt water had eroded the foundation, causing one corner to sink. The whole structure leaned at a sickening angle. On the top floor, curtains still hung in windows. Someone had spray painted, "We are still here," across the brick facade, though no one was visible. The Coast Guard officer told me they'd evacuated the last residents 3 days earlier, an elderly couple who'd refused to leave until their cat returned home. The cat never did. Let me share something personal. My daughter Emma turned 10 yesterday. We celebrated in our new apartment, 20 blocks inland from our old house. We couldn't afford the insurance on our old place after the 3rd flood. Not that anyone was buying property in that zone anyway. I showed Emma pictures of the beach where I used to take her as a toddler. That beach doesn't exist anymore. She asked me where the sand went. I didn't have the heart to tell her it's now part of the seafloor, that the coastline she sees on maps in her digital school books is fiction. Instead, I told her about the new beaches forming further inland, how coastlines have always changed throughout Earth's history. I didn't tell her that those natural processes usually take thousands of years, not a single decade. I didn't tell her about the projections for where the water will be by the time she graduates high school. I promised myself I wouldn't get emotional on air anymore. My producer says it hurts our credibility. But how do you report on the slow drowning of your hometown without feeling something? Last night, I dreamt I was swimming through the halls of my old elementary school. The exit signs glowed eerily in the murky water. Fish darted in and out of classrooms. When I woke, I found myself gasping for air. Let's get to today's updates. The city's new pumping stations are operational in sectors 3 through 7. Residents in those areas should see reduced street flooding during normal tides. The floating market will open at 10 a.m. near what used to be Harbor Park. The water taxi service has added a new stop at Highland Avenue, which is, quite frankly, something I never thought I'd say. Highland used to be 4 miles inland. I received word from the fishing cooperative that the shifting salinity has pushed the traditional fishing grounds further offshore, but they're adapting. The shellfish are another story. The acidification has hit them hard. Remember when local oysters were our claim to fame? Now they're becoming memory, like so many things. Yesterday I spoke with a third-generation oyster farmer who's transitioning to growing seaweed. He showed me his hands, calloused from decades of work with oyster cages and shucking knives. These waters are in my blood, he told me, even if they're killing what my family has harvested for 100 years. He's retrofitted his boat with underwater growing platforms for kelp and dulse. Adaptation in real time. For those wondering about the barrier construction, the Army Corps of Engineers reports they're on schedule for the West Bay section. Too little, too late for some neighborhoods, but better than nothing. I've been told the new barriers can handle another 2 feet of sea level rise. The estimates say we'll hit that mark in about 12 years. Of course, those are the same estimates that said we wouldn't be where we are now until 2060. I drive past the construction site every morning on my way to the station. The concrete walls rise like the ramparts of some ancient fortress, our modern attempt to hold back the sea. Sometimes I see children playing along the top of the finished sections, running and laughing as if it's just another playground feature. They don't remember when beaches were open expanses rather than narrow strips trapped between water and wall. 3 nights ago I couldn't sleep. I drove down to the barrier site around 2 a.m. The moonlight on the water was beautiful in the most terrible way. The tide was high, waves slapping against the unfinished sections of the wall. I stood there for nearly an hour, watching the water rise and fall, imagining what it will be like when the wall is complete. Will we feel safe behind it, or will we feel like prisoners trapped between the advancing sea and the shrinking land? A salvage crew made a strange discovery last week in the flooded business district. As they were clearing debris from what used to be the First National Bank building, they found a time capsule that had been sealed in the cornerstone when the building was constructed in 1955. Inside were newspapers, photographs, a few coins, and letters from city officials describing their hopes for the future. Not one of them mentioned the ocean as a threat. Their greatest concerns were the Cold War and urban development. They wrote about a prosperous city expanding toward the shore, building grand hotels and boardwalks to showcase the beautiful coastline. I held those water-damaged papers in my hands. The ink had blurred in places, but the optimism was still legible. One letter from the bank president described how his grandchildren would someday walk the same streets, patronize the same businesses, enjoy the same views. His grandchildren are in their 60s now. I wonder if any of them are among my listeners this morning. I wonder if they remember the city their grandfather described, or if they've joined the growing exodus to higher ground. The mental health support line has extended its hours to 24/7. Use code COASTAL when you call for services specific to climate displacement. They've added counselors who specialize in solastalgia, the distress caused by environmental change around your home. a new word for a new kind of grief. I've been thinking about historical parallels, about Dunwich in England, a medieval port city gradually claimed by the North Sea between the 13th and 15th centuries, about the lost Egyptian cities of Thonis Heracleion and Canopus, discovered on the seafloor in the early 2000s, about the original Alexandria lighthouse, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, toppled by earthquakes and now lying beneath the Mediterranean. The difference is the speed. Those cities took centuries to succumb. We're watching neighborhoods disappear in real time within a single generation. A team of archaeologists from the university has begun documenting our city's transformation. They're calling it accelerated archaeology, the study of how modern human settlements transform into archaeological sites within decades rather than centuries. They're taking core samples of the sediment already accumulating over roads and foundations. They're photo-documenting buildings before they're underwater. They're interviewing residents about the locations of important community sites, schools, places of worship, gathering spots, creating maps for future researchers who will only be able to access these places with diving equipment. It makes me wonder how future generations will tell our story. Will they see us as victims, as adapters, as the people who saw the water coming but kept building by the shore anyway? I visited one of our city's temporary housing zones last week, those prefabricated units set up on the old golf course. Over 1,000 people living in what was supposed to be emergency shelter, but has become semi-permanent for many. The residents have started gardens between the units. They've painted murals on the plain walls. Children have named the rows of identical structures, Ocean Street, Harbor Way, Lighthouse Lane, commemorating the places they've left behind. In the community hall, they've created a memory wall, photographs of homes and businesses now underwater, street scenes from neighborhoods that no longer exist, notes and stories sharing what was lost beyond the physical structures, a first kiss on the pier, a marriage proposal in the gazebo at Crescent Park, a family business passed through 4 generations, the summer evening when an orca pod came unusually close to shore and everyone ran down to watch. I met a woman there in her 80s who'd lived her entire life within 3 blocks of the harbor. She told me about how she used to measure the distance to the water by the sound of the foghorns, how she could tell which way the wind was blowing by the calls of the gulls. The water was always part of us, she said, but not like this, never like this. She showed me a jar of sand she'd collected from her street on the day they evacuated. It was already beneath a few inches of water, she told me. I reached down and scooped it up before I got in the rescue boat. I needed something solid to hold on to. I understand that impulse, to grasp something tangible as the familiar slips away. Emergency management officials have updated the evacuation map again. The yellow zone, which used to begin at Maple Street, now extends all the way to Pine Road. Residents in this expanded zone are advised to keep go bags ready and to have evacuation plans in place. Those with limited mobility should register with the community response team for priority evacuation assistance. The city is installing new tidal gauges along what used to be Riverside Drive. The old ones became useless when their mounting positions were permanently submerged. The new ones use a different system entirely, measuring from fixed points on higher ground rather than from historic sea level markers that no longer apply. For those of you tracking these things at home, as I know many of you do, the technical term for what we're experiencing is non-linear sea level rise. For decades, the ocean rose gradually, almost imperceptibly, a millimeter here, a millimeter there. But as the warming oceans reach deeper into the ice shelves of Antarctica and Greenland, as the great glaciers accelerate their movement toward the sea, the rise becomes more dramatic. Step changes rather than a smooth slope. I keep a measuring stick outside my window, not for broadcasting purposes. Our station uses the official NOAA data, but for myself. A physical record I can see with my own eyes. I mark it each week. The marks have become closer together over the past year. For families still in the flood-prone areas, the school district has announced that attendance policies remain flexible. No child will be penalized for missing school due to evacuation or flooding. The virtual learning options developed during the pandemic have become permanent for these intermittently displaced students. I think of my own daughter, who has already attended 3 different schools because of our relocations, how her understanding of home is more fluid than mine ever was, how she packs her treasured possessions in a special backpack when storm warnings are issued, just in case. The university's climate migration study has published its first findings. Over 15% of our community has permanently relocated inland in the past 5 years. Another 22% are what they call cyclical migrants, maintaining homes here but moving to higher ground during storm seasons or king tides. The remaining residents are divided between those planning to leave when financially possible. I wonder where I fall in those categories. I wonder where you do, listening to me now. Last month, I interviewed a family who'd converted their 3-story home into what they call a retreat-in-place dwelling. They've waterproofed the first floor, installed watertight doors and windows, moved all electrical systems to the upper floors, and added a rooftop garden and rainwater collection system. They showed me their solar panels, their composting toilet system, their stockpile of preserved food. The water's coming, the father told me, but we're going to float with it rather than run from it. I admired their preparedness, their determination to remain in place, but I also noticed their children's waterproof tablets contained information about inland schools, contingency plans within contingency plans. After the break, I'll be speaking with community organizers from the Highlands Mutual Aid Network about their rooftop garden initiative. Also, updates on the federal relocation assistance program and this week's high tide schedule. Before I go to break, one more personal note. This morning, as I made my way to the station in the pre-dawn darkness, I saw something unexpected. A pair of dolphins swimming up what used to be Broad Street, their sleek bodies cut through the water, visible in the dim light from the few functioning street lamps along the flooded avenue. They moved with such grace, such belonging, as if this had always been their territory. In a way, I suppose it had been. We were just borrowing it for a while. This is Marcus Reed, still broadcasting, still here, still keeping our heads above water. Welcome back to Coastal Radio 103.5. This is Marcus Reed, your voice in the rising tide. It's June 3rd, 2033, and we're broadcasting from our new location in the Old Bell Tower, which thankfully stands on what engineers are now calling persistent land. I want to talk about adaptation today. It's been fascinating, and I use that word with all its complicated implications, to watch how we've changed as a community in the past year. Last night, I witnessed something I never thought I'd see. A wedding procession moving through what used to be Harborview Avenue, now a 3-foot deep canal. The bride stood at the bow of a refitted fishing boat, her white dress catching the light of lanterns strung between the buildings that still line the street. Bridesmaids and groomsmen followed in kayaks, decorated with flowers and ribbons. They were heading to the old courthouse, its first floor submerged, but its grand staircase still rising above the waterline, where a judge waited to perform the ceremony. As they passed beneath my window, The small group of musicians aboard the trailing boat played an old love song, the notes skipping across the water. Yesterday, I visited the floating school that operates out of connected barges in what used to be Nelson Park. The children were having swimming lessons, not as recreation, but as critical survival training. Every child now learns not just reading and mathematics, but how to repair solar panels, purify water, and navigate by stars. Skills that were niche just a few years ago are now part of basic education. I interviewed the school's principal, who showed me their improvised science lab, where students monitor water quality and catalog the marine species that have moved into their neighborhood. We're not just teaching them to survive in this new world, she told me. We're teaching them to understand it, to help shape what comes next. What struck me most was the children's resilience. They raced across the floating walkways between classroom barges with the same energy kids once brought to playground games. They had inside jokes about particular tides and weather patterns. They maintained a detailed map of the submerged landscape beneath them, updating it with each new discovery, creating their own geography. I spoke with Miss Parikh, who teaches environmental science there. She told me something that stuck with me. She said, "We're raising a generation of children who won't know a stable coastline, who will understand geography as something that changes season to season." It reminds me of Emma, who now corrects me when I absent-mindedly refer to places by their old locations. "Dad," she says, "Monroe Street is underwater now. You mean Upper Monroe. Out of the mouths of babes." 3 days ago, I witnessed the launch of the community's first purpose-built floating medical clinic. Dr. Chen, who once ran a traditional practice on Main Street, rallied support from both local businesses and a medical technology company inland to retrofit a former tour boat. The vessel now houses examination rooms, a small laboratory, and even a modest surgical suite for emergencies when transport to the mainland hospital isn't possible. I watched as they christened the boat, not with champagne, but with fresh water, a more precious resource these days. "We go where our patients are," Dr. Chen said as the small crowd cheered. "Medicine has always been about adapting to new challenges." Later that same day, they treated 17 patients, performed 2 minor surgeries, and delivered a baby girl whose parents named her Marina, a nod to their new maritime life. The architectural changes are remarkable too. I remember when the first houses on stilts seemed so strange, like alien structures imposed on our familiar landscape. Now they're everywhere. New construction is all elevated, with breakaway first floors designed to let storm surges pass through without destroying the entire structure. The amphibious housing along Carter Boulevard actually rises with the floodwaters, floating on pontoons when necessary, and settling back down when the waters recede. Last week during the king tide, I watched one of these amphibious houses lift gently from its foundation as the water rose. The family sat on their porch, children dangling their feet in the water, calmly eating dinner as their home became a temporary island. They waved to passing boats as if this were completely normal. For them, I suppose it now is. Then there are the boats. So many boats. People living on boats who never imagined a maritime life. Former accountants and retail workers and bus drivers, all becoming reluctant sailors. The marina, which has tripled in size and sprawls through what was once the downtown shopping district, has become its own community, with floating markets, medical clinics, and even a boat that serves as a mobile library. 2 weeks ago, I spent the night aboard the library boat, a former river barge now filled with carefully preserved books and solar-powered e-readers. The librarian, Ms. Winters, has become a central figure in our community, not just distributing reading material, but collecting and preserving local knowledge. "Books have always been vessels," she told me, as we sat surrounded by shelves secured with netting to prevent them from toppling in rough water. They carry ideas across time. Now they're just doing it more literally. Throughout the night, people arrived in small boats and canoes, returning books, borrowing new ones, staying to share news and stories. The library has become a floating town square, a place where information flows as steadily as the tide. I think about my father often these days. He passed away before the worst of this began, thankfully. He was a carpenter who built things to last generations. What would he think of our new impermanence, of buildings designed to be abandoned, of roads that serve as canals half the time, of entire neighborhoods surrendered to the sea? Yet I think he would recognize something in the craftsmanship of the floating docks, in the ingenious ways people have retrofitted old structures for new purposes. Adaptation requires its own kind of skill, its own craftsmanship. Yesterday I watched a group of former construction workers installing a series of connected walkways between rooftops in the Eastern District. These improvised sky bridges allow residents to move between buildings without boats during high tide. They worked with salvaged materials, lumber from abandoned houses, steel cable from a decommissioned ferry, flotation devices made from sealed plastic drums. They were inventing a new architecture on the fly, problem solving with whatever was at hand. The lead builder pointed out how they were incorporating flexibility into every connection, allowing the walkways to rise and fall with the buildings as they settled unevenly in the increasingly saturated ground. We used to build to resist change, he told me. Now we build to move with it. Some personal news. I've started keeping a detailed journal of the changes, not just the sea level measurements and the storm frequencies that we report on air, but the smaller things. The way salt water has killed the old oak trees along Memorial Drive, the fact that the air smells different now, brinier, even miles inland, the way everyone talks about property in terms of elevation rather than square footage, the sound of hull against hull, a gentle knocking that's become the background music of our lives. I'm not just documenting all this for posterity, though I suppose that's part of it. I'm trying to make sense of it for myself, for Emma, for all of us who remember the before times but will live most of our lives in the after. 2 nights ago, there was a moment that crystallized this strange transition for me. I was returning home after a late broadcast, rowing my small boat through what used to be the community park. The moon was nearly full, casting enough light to navigate without my lamp. As I passed the submerged bandstand where summer concerts once took place, I heard music. A small group had gathered on the bandstand's roof, which now sits just a few feet above the water. Someone was playing a salvaged upright piano. How they got it up there, I can't imagine. Others had guitars, a violin, a set of drums made from repurposed buckets and containers. People had come in boats of all kinds, forming a floating audience around the impromptu stage. I stopped rowing and drifted at the edge of the crowd. They were playing old songs, the kind everyone knows the words to, the kind we sang before, but they'd changed some of the lyrics, updated them to reflect our new reality. There was sadness in the music, yes, but something else too. Defiance, perhaps. A refusal to stop making beauty, even as the world transforms around us. A young woman with intricate braids stood up to sing. Her voice carried across the water, clear and strong. She sang about the old streets now serving as channels, about learning the language of tides and currents, about homes becoming vessels. We are all sailors now, went the chorus, navigating by new stars. I sat in my little boat until the final song, then rowed home through the moonlit streets turned canals, the music still echoing in my mind. The City Council will vote tomorrow on the proposed retreat from the eastern neighborhoods. It's a formality at this point. Those streets have been underwater more often than not for months. Insurance won't cover rebuilding there anymore. Another invisible line on the map, another slice of our community surrendered. What's remarkable isn't that we're retreating. That's inevitable, but how we're doing it. Not in panic, not all at once, but in this measured, almost ceremonial way. The Eastern Neighborhood Association held what they called a farewell festival last weekend. People returned to their former homes, those still accessible, to retrieve any remaining possessions and to say goodbye. They shared meals on improvised tables set up on rooftops. They painted murals on the upper walls of buildings soon to be abandoned, images of what had been there before and visions of what might come after. Marine biologists from the university spoke about the new ecosystems already forming in the submerged areas. There were tears, of course, but also this sense of marking a transition rather than simply experiencing a loss. Later, as dusk fell, they launched hundreds of small, biodegradable lanterns into the water, each carrying written memories of the neighborhood. I watched from the bell tower as the lights spread through the flooded streets, a constellation of remembrance drifting slowly toward the sea. We're developing rituals for this new reality, finding ways to acknowledge what's happening that go beyond the raw data of inches risen and acres lost. This is Marcus Reed, your neighbor in uncertain times, reminding you that adaptation isn't just about survival, it's about finding new ways to live. Good morning, listeners. This is Marcus Reed with Coastal Radio, broadcasting on this clear September day in 2034. I'm doing something different today. I've taken our portable equipment up to Observatory Hill to look out over what we now call the Bay District. The water sparkles in the morning sun. From up here, if you didn't know better, you might think it was always meant to be this way. Nature has a way of making our human disruptions seem intentional, of incorporating our mistakes into its design. The new shoreline curves gracefully where once there were straight streets and right angles. Water finds its own geometry. Before dawn this morning, I watched a school of baitfish move through the sunken intersection of 5th and Main, their silver bodies catching the first light as they navigated between submerged traffic lights. A great blue heron stood motionless on the roof of the old post office, its reflection perfect in the still water, before suddenly plunging its beak to catch breakfast. The juxtaposition was surreal, ancient predator and prey behaviors playing out in our transformed urban setting. I can see the new harbor from here, bustling with activity, fishing boats heading out, water taxis ferrying people between the remaining land neighborhoods, the larger vessels bringing supplies from up north. The floating markets are colorful dots on the water, bright canopies over boats laden with produce and goods. 2 years ago, this view would have included shopping centers, housing developments, and the old industrial park. Now it's a bay, with the tops of streetlights sometimes visible at low tide, like periscopes from a submerged world. 3 weeks ago, I joined a salvage expedition to the former financial district. The dive team has been methodically working through the underwater city, retrieving important documents, artwork, historical items, anything that might still be preserved despite months or years underwater. I observed from their support boat as divers disappeared into the dark doorway of the old First National building, emerging later with sealed containers of backup drives and historical records. The dive coordinator, a former Navy SEAL who now runs these recovery operations, described how disorienting it is to navigate these underwater spaces. The human brain isn't wired to process urban environments filled with water, he told me. Doorways you'd expect to be accessible are warped shut. Stairwells become vertical swim-throughs. Everything familiar becomes alien. What struck me was how he described the silence. People expect it to be creepy, he said, but there's a strange peace down there. The water muffles everything. It's like moving through a dream version of the city. Between dives, one team member showed me photographs they'd taken of an office where papers were still on desks, swaying gently in the currents. A break room where coffee mugs sat on tables as if their owners had just stepped away for a moment and would soon return. A conference room where a whiteboard still held faintly visible notes from a meeting that ended when the evacuation order came. Last week I interviewed residents from the former Oak Ridge neighborhood, now a collection of houseboats and floating platforms anchored roughly where their streets used to be. They've named their floating community New Oak Ridge, and they still celebrate their old neighborhood block party each summer, just on water instead of asphalt. I spent the night aboard the central platform, a converted barge that serves as their community hub. What they've created is remarkable. Walkways of salvaged wood and plastic connect the various vessels. Solar panels and small wind turbines are mounted wherever space allows. Every surface that can hold soil grows food. Tomatoes, peppers, herbs, spiraling up cleverly designed vertical gardens. They collect rainwater in a series of interconnected barrels, filtering it through a home-built system. Maria Delgado, who used to run the corner grocery and now operates from a converted fishing trawler, told me something that resonated deeply. She said, "We didn't lose our community when we lost the land. The buildings went, but the people stayed, and that's what matters." I've been thinking about that a lot. About what remains when the physical structures of our lives are transformed or taken away. As night fell over New Oak Ridge, residents gathered on the central platform for a community meal. They pulled their tables together into one long line, strings of solar lights illuminating faces both familiar and new. A recently arrived family was formally welcomed, introduced to everyone, and presented with a handmade map of the floating neighborhood and a small waterproof container of seeds for their starter garden. At one point during the evening, someone noticed a leak in one of the connected walkways. Within minutes, 3 people had brought tools and materials, working together to make repairs without disrupting the gathering. No formal request, no assigned maintenance crew, just the immediate understanding that in this precarious new world, everyone participates in maintaining the literal and figurative connections that keep them afloat. I've been to many community gatherings in my years as a reporter, but I've never felt the level of interdependence I witnessed that night. Perhaps this is what we needed all along. Perhaps the water hasn't just taken things away, it's also stripped us down to what matters. There's been an unexpected side effect of our new geography, a return to localism. With fuel costs and transport challenges, we rely more on what can be produced nearby. The hydroponic farms built on top of the old shopping center parking garages, the marine protein harvesting operations, the desalination plants that have become as essential as power stations. Last Thursday, I toured the largest of these hydroponic installations, a massive greenhouse complex constructed on the abandoned top level of what was once our biggest shopping mall. The manager walked me through rows of leafy greens growing in nutrient-rich water, stacked in vertical systems that maximize the use of space. Nothing is wasted. The water circulates constantly. Fish tanks integrated into the system provide natural fertilizer, and solar panels on the roof power the necessary pumps and lighting. We produce enough here to feed about 30% of our remaining population, the manager told me as we stood among towers of strawberry plants. Before all this, most of our food traveled an average of 1,500 miles to reach us. Now it's more like 1.5 miles. What's most striking is how the operation employs people who lost their previous livelihoods to the water. Former retail workers, office administrators, and car salespeople now carefully tend these plants, monitor water quality, and distribute produce throughout the community. Their knowledge is highly specialized, developed through necessity and constant experimentation. I watched a former investment banker delicately pollinating tomato flowers with a small brush. I used to move money around, he told me with a wry smile. Now I help create something real, something we need. The scientists call what we're experiencing coastal squeeze. As the water rises, we're caught between the advancing sea and the fixed infrastructure inland. The natural shoreline would typically retreat, beaches would reform further inland, marshes would migrate, but our roads and buildings and seawalls don't allow for that natural movement. So we end up with this new reality. Urban areas becoming marine environments. You can see evidence of this ecological transformation everywhere. The red mangrove seedlings taking root along the flooded avenues downtown, planted by the university's restoration team. The oyster mats attached to submerged concrete structures, creating living breakwaters that grow stronger over time. The artificial reef modules placed strategically throughout the new bay, providing habitat for marine life while reducing wave energy during storms. I visited the university's Marine Research Center yesterday, where they're documenting the creation of what they call novel ecosystems, ecological communities that have never existed before, mixtures of native species and newcomers adapting to our newly aquatic urban spaces. Fish swimming through submerged parking garages, oysters attaching to submerged concrete barriers, seabirds nesting on abandoned upper floors of office buildings. The lead researcher showed me their underwater camera feeds from various locations throughout the flooded districts. On one screen, a school of striped bass moved through what had been the public library's main reading room, navigating between bookshelves, now swaying with algae. On another, blue crabs scuttled across the marble floor of the old courthouse, taking shelter beneath benches where people once waited for their cases to be called. We're witnessing evolution in real time, the researcher explained, pointing to data showing how quickly certain species are adapting to these hybrid environments. These creatures don't know they're living in a human tragedy. They're just finding opportunities in a changing environment. Life finds a way, as they say, but it's rarely the way we expected or planned for. The weather's turning, as it does more suddenly these days. The new climate patterns still catch me off guard sometimes. The meteorologists say we can expect stronger temperature gradients between the cooler water and the warmer land, creating more localized storm cells, especially in the afternoons. Yesterday, I experienced one of these microbursts while interviewing a team installing new navigational markers. Within minutes, the sky darkened, wind whipped across the water, and rain fell in sheets so thick I could barely see the boat next to ours. 30 minutes later, it was gone, leaving us drenched, but the water around us eerily calm, as if nothing had happened. These sudden storms have become part of our daily calculations. No one travels without checking both the tide tables and the increasingly granular weather forecasts. Most boats now carry portable weather radars, and a system of warning flags has been established throughout the community. Raised quickly when conditions deteriorate, visible from most vantage points around the bay. Emma joined the school's Coastal Restoration Club last week. They're working with marine biologists to plant seagrass in the shallows of what used to be Veterans Memorial Park. The seagrass helps prevent erosion, filters the water, and provides habitat for fish nurseries. She came home with mud up to her elbows and a spark in her eyes I haven't seen in a long time. "Dad," she said, "we're building the new world." Out of the mouths of babes, indeed. I visited her project site on Sunday. 24 teenagers and their mentors from the university waded through knee-deep water, carefully planting plugs of seagrass in the silty bottom. The park's old flagpole still stood at the center, now rising from the water like a sentinel. Someone had attached a new flag, a simple blue-green design with a stylized wave pattern. When I asked one of the students about it, she looked surprised by my question. "It's our bay flag," she said, as if it had always existed, as if this body of water had always been here, with its own identity, its own symbol. The teenagers moved through their work with focused determination and surprising knowledge, identifying different species of seagrass, discussing salinity levels and sediment composition. One boy, no more than 14, explained to me how they were creating living infrastructure that would grow stronger over time, unlike the concrete barriers and seawalls that inevitably degrade. The old way was to fight the water, he said with the confidence of someone who has already accepted a truth many adults still resist. We're learning to work with it instead. I sometimes wonder what visitors must think when they come here. Those who knew our city before and those who are seeing it for the first time. Is it a tragedy to them, a curiosity, a warning? Or is it, as it's slowly becoming to us, simply home? This is Marcus Reed, watching the clouds roll in over our new coastline, signing off for now. Backup generators are holding for now. If you're just tuning in, this is Marcus Reed with Coastal Radio's emergency broadcast. Hurricane Olivia has strengthened to a Category 4 and made an unexpected turn toward our region. It's 3:15 a.m. on August 8th, 2035, and we're tracking the storm from our emergency studio in the municipal building's upper floors. The satellite link keeps dropping, but our latest information shows the eye wall approximately 40 miles offshore and moving toward us at 14 knots. Wind speeds have reached 155 miles per hour. The barometric pressure continues to drop. All signs point to further intensification before landfall. Something massive just struck the building. For those who can hear us, evacuation zones A through D are under mandatory evacuation orders. Zones E and F are now advised to evacuate as well. The storm surge is expected to reach 15 feet above current sea level, which would put water well into areas previously considered safe. I can see the water rising from my window. The emergency floodlights illuminate a dark, churning surface where streets should be. The rain is falling in horizontal sheets. Debris races through the floodwaters below. Pieces of wood, plastic, unidentifiable fragments of what used to be homes and businesses. The Weather Service has issued a flash flood warning for the Western Highlands as well, areas that have never flooded before. The ground is already saturated from weeks of unusually heavy precipitation, leaving nowhere for the rain to go. We're trapped between rising seawater from the east and runoff from the highlands to the west. The city has become a bathtub with no drain. This is the third major hurricane this season, and we're only in August. The warming ocean is like fuel for these storms. Warmer water means more energy transferred to the atmosphere, which means stronger winds, more rain, and higher storm surges. 2 hours ago, I watched from this window as the last evacuation boats left the central harbor. The Coast Guard performed a final sweep through the floating districts, their spotlights cutting through the darkness and intensifying rain. Their radio transmissions described harrowing rescues, people who had waited too long, who thought their floating homes or elevated structures could withstand the storm. The last transmission I heard before they moved out of range reported pulling an elderly couple from the roof of their flooding houseboat as it began to break apart beneath them. I've been at this station for 18 years now, through floods and storms and the steady rise of the waters, but I've never seen the meteorologists look as concerned as they did at this evening's briefing. The combination of sea level rise, land subsidence, and increasingly powerful storms has created what one official called a compound threat landscape. In plain language, that means the dangers multiply each other. The building just shuddered again. The power flickered, but held. Our chief engineer assures me the generators are secure on the top floor and have fuel for another 48 hours. We'll stay on air as long as the transmitter holds. If the main antenna fails, we'll switch to our backup system with reduced range. If that fails too, we'll continue recording. Someone should document what happens here tonight. I've just received word that the eastern seawall has been breached. If you're in the Harborview district or east of Maple Avenue, water is coming. Move to higher floors immediately if you haven't evacuated. The wall was our last major defense against storm surge for the eastern districts. It was built to withstand Category 3 storm conditions. Hurricane Olivia has exceeded those parameters. The initial breach was reported near Junction 5, where the new construction connected to the older barriers. Water is pouring through like a broken dam. I need to take a moment here, if you'll indulge me. Emma is at her mother's house in the Western Highlands tonight. They should be well above any flooding, but I haven't been able to reach them by phone for the past hour, as the cell networks are becoming overwhelmed. I know many of you are in similar situations, separated from loved ones, waiting for word. This is the hardest part of these storms, not knowing. Before I came on air tonight, I made a video message for Emma, just in case. I told her how proud I am of her, how amazed I am by her generation's resilience and determination. I told her things I should probably say more often in person. The building is taking a beating, but it was retrofitted after the 2032 floods. The structural engineers assured us it can withstand much worse than this. Still, it's humbling to feel a concrete building move in the wind. 10 minutes ago, a support vessel from the offshore wind farm contacted us via marine radio. They're reporting wave heights of over 30 feet in the open water. The turbines have automatically feathered their blades and locked down, but 2 maintenance workers are stranded on the service platform. Helicopter rescue is impossible in these conditions. They've battened down in the protective shelter and have supplies for 3 days. All we can do is wait and hope the platform holds. We have updates from the coastal science team monitoring the storm surge. The combination of the hurricane's low pressure system, which actually lifts the water level underneath it, the driving winds pushing water ashore, the higher baseline sea level, and the fact that the storm is moving slowly, almost stalling offshore, it's creating what they're calling a maximum water level event. Places that have never flooded before are expected to be underwater by morning. And this isn't just seawater we're talking about. The heavy rainfall means the rivers and streams are overflowing too. Water from both directions. The drones the emergency management team deployed earlier this evening have all been lost to the wind. Our eyes in the sky are gone. We're blind, except for the stationary cameras mounted on high points throughout the city, and many of those are already offline. One camera still functioning shows the new harbor district. The carefully constructed floating docks have broken free. Boats are colliding with each other, with buildings, with the remains of the old streetlights. Some have already sunk. Others are being driven inland by the surge. I can see the community boathouse, or what's left of it, where just last week I attended a celebration for the completion of their solar power system. It's on its side now, half submerged. Solar panels torn away. I think about the old-timers I interviewed when I first started reporting on sea level rise. They talked about floods as rare events, historic moments that define generations. Now they're becoming background noise to our lives. The constant adaptation, preparation, recovery, repeat. The window beside me is vibrating with each gust. The sound is like a living thing, hungry and hunting. I've covered enough storms to recognize the pattern. Moments of relative calm punctuated by roaring crescendos as the spiral bands of the hurricane pass over us. Each band brings new intensity, and we're still hours from the worst of it. This is an emergency alert. The West Side Reservoir Dam is showing signs of structural compromise. Those in the Western Valley should move to high ground immediately. This is not a drill. That's new information to me as well. The West Side Reservoir was our main freshwater storage. If that dam fails, we're looking at a major flash flooding event in the western districts that were supposed to be our safe zones for this storm. Emma and her mother are in the western highlands, above the reservoir. If the dam breaks, they should still be safe. But the roads below them, their evacuation routes, would be cut off. They would be stranded, along with thousands of others who sought refuge in what we thought were the safest areas. I'm being told we have engineers en route to assess the dam, but with the roads in their current condition, it will take time. The reservoir was expanded 3 years ago to collect the increased rainfall we've been experiencing. More capacity meant higher water pressure against an aging structure. The monitoring systems were updated, but the core infrastructure dates back to the 1970s. Another case of our old world struggling to contain the new realities. A report just came in from the Marina District. The surge has lifted several houseboats over the remaining seawall. They're now floating through what used to be the financial district, carried by the combination of tide and wind. Families are trapped inside these improvised arcs, riding out the storm in structures never designed for such conditions. Search and rescue operations are impossible until the wind subsides. They are on their own. So this is where we are, friends, caught between the rising sea and the falling rain, between the infrastructure of the past and the demands of the present. The camera feed from downtown just showed something I never thought I'd witness. The old clock tower, the one landmark that survived the original flooding, that became a symbol of our community's resilience, has collapsed. One moment it was there, standing against the storm as it had for over a century. The next, it was gone. A piece of our skyline, of our history, erased in seconds. Wait, I'm receiving an emergency transmission from one of the evacuation shelters in the North District. They're reporting structural damage to the roof. Water is coming in. They have over 300 people inside, including elderly residents from the assisted living facility and patients evacuated from the medical center. The shelter coordinator is requesting immediate assistance, but in these conditions, I don't see how help can reach them. The wind is finding new voices now, whistling through cracks, booming against walls, screaming around corners. The building continues to shake. The rain against the windows sounds like gravel being thrown by the handful. I know this broadcast sounds grim. It is grim. I won't sugarcoat that, but we've weathered storms before. Not like this one perhaps, but we've adapted again and again, and we will adapt to this too, whatever the morning brings. For 6 generations, people have called this place home. Through wars and economic depressions, through previous floods and fires and storms, What we're experiencing now is not just another challenge, it's a transformation. Some call it a death, others a rebirth. Perhaps it's both simultaneously. This storm will pass, the waters will recede, not to their previous levels, but to whatever the new normal becomes. We will emerge, take stock of what remains, and begin again. This is what we do. This is what we've always done.